our conference program, there's a more detailed biography for all the speakers, as well as on our webpage. But let me welcome Amy Kind, our final speaker for today. Amy is the Russell K. Pitzer Professor of Philosophy at Claremont McKenna College. And some of you know, got some really interesting edited work and the work that Lucas has already mentioned. So without further ado, I'll let Amy begin her talk. Thank you.
Thanks. It's been a really great day. Thanks for hanging in the entire day. Hopefully you can make it 1 hour more. And I wanted to thank the organizers and also especially all of the graduate students, minders who have been making sure we don't get lost and we get food and all the rest. That's been very helpful. So thank you to everyone. So my talk is called Contrast or Continuum, the Case of Belief and Imagination. I'm going to be talking about this thesis, what I'll call the continuum thesis, continuity thesis, which claims something like, I'll go into more detail in a second, but claims something like, rather than looking at belief and imagination as sharply contrasting or different states, we should instead see them as on a continuum where there are intermediate mental states between them. So I am going to be suggesting that the case for the continuum thesis is considerably weaker than its proponents would have us believe. That's in part because I believe that there is such a thing as imagination, in contrast to our last speaker. But it's also because I just don't think that the proponents of this thesis have shown us that we should give up the idea that there's a contrast. And I also think that there are important considerations about imagination that make the continuum thesis implausible. I don't think I'll have time probably to say much about them, but maybe they'll come out in discussion. But it's that thought that's sort of motivating part of what I'm going to be saying. So my basic plan is to try to explain to you what the continuum thesis is, look at what I take to be the arguments that have been given in the literature for the continuum thesis, then I'll try myself to assess the arguments, and if I have time, I will give you some closing thoughts. We'll see. So first part of the talk on trying to explain the continuum thesis. So I'm basically going to be relying on 3 different sources, and I'm going to look at them in chronological order. So the first source is from a paper by Curry and Giuriadini called Narrative and Coherence from 2004. And they, in that paper, are exploring the idea that belief and imagination are not exclusive categories. And in the paper, they propose a framework which accepts the existence of both beliefs and imaginings, but allows for the possibility of states which, while neither fitting well into the category of beliefs or imaginings, exhibit some features of both. So they suggest this idea in 2004, and then we have Andy Egan in 2009 in a paper called Imagination, Delusion, and Self-Deception, who also puts forth an argument that there exist attitudes that are intermediate between belief and imagination. And he thinks that these states have some of the distinctive characteristics of belief and some of the distinctive characteristics of imagining. And so he calls these intermediate states by imagination. I'm not really going to use that word. He's also the guy who gives us the word I desire, so I think he likes these kinds of phrasings, but in any case, the thought is that there are these intermediate states. And what he says is that there seems to be no principled reason to think that we can't get a spectrum of cases from clear, totally non-belief-like imaginings to clear, full-blooded paradigmatic beliefs with intermediate, hard-to-classify states in the middle. Okay. So the last text I'm working with is a paper by Susanna Schellenberg from 2013 called Belief and Desire, Imagination and Immersion. And Schellenberg here also is yet another person who's arguing for the existence of these intermediate kind of states. And like Egan, she thinks that the explanation for this depends partly on considerations stemming from thinking about functional roles. But unlike Egan, she also focuses on a further issue, which is whether the subjects take their subject matter to be true. So she adds a further element into the discussion. She says, the sense in which there is a continuum of mental states between imaginings and beliefs is, in at least in some respects, analogous to the sense in which there is a continuum of colors between yellow and red. But she also wants to say when someone is in one of the intermediate states, her mental state may not be easily categorized as either an imagining or as a belief, analogous to the way shades between yellow and red may not be easily categorized as either yellow or red. But she says this does not mean that we have to deny that there's a conceptual distinction between belief and imagination. Because even though there might be these intermediate states between yellow and red that we can't classify as easily as yellow or red, there's still a conceptual distinction between yellow and red. So she thinks, well, there might be intermediate states between belief and imagination, but that doesn't mean that there's no conceptual distinction between the two. Okay, so the way that Schellenberg describes the continuum thesis is a little different from the way that Curry and Giardini described their own thesis. So the possibility that Curry and Giardini proposed, it does explicitly involve the abandonment of a categorical belief-imagination distinction. So what they end up proposing is something like vaguely specified clusterings in a many-dimensional cognitive space. So I'm going to be focusing on something that says the thesis that I'm focusing on is a thesis that charges that there's this continuum between imagination and belief, or intermediate states, and that's what I'm calling the continuum thesis. And we can take that to be a little bit different from this cluster idea that seems to be present in Curry and Giardini. I think there's a lot in common between the two, but the cluster view thinks that we have, say, like 6 different dimensions on which mental states can differ. So we have A, B, C, D, E, and F, right? 6 different dimensions. And then we've chosen to focus on 2 different clusterings that are particularly common. So maybe there's like an ABC clustering and a DEF clustering. And that kind of clustering of these traits happens a lot. So we call the first kind belief and the second kind imagining. Because those are the clusterings that commonly go together. But there are other clustering. There are other ways that we can divide things up, other ways that we can cluster. And depending on our explanatory interest, those other clusterings might make more sense. And they might help us, clustering in a different way, might help us to explain some phenomena that we can't otherwise explain if we just cluster it in one way. So they think that in different situations we might want to cluster in different ways. Okay, so I don't know, I think it's an interesting question about exactly the difference between cluster and continuity and how different these views are, but I'm going to try and focus on the version that's the just straight continuum view. So I think that means that we have 4 possible views, at least 4 possible views floating around. So we have the contrast view, and the people who believe that, well, there's a large consensus of people who believe that. The thought here is that imagination is a distinct cognitive attitude from belief. So Sam Lau and Tamar Gendler in the Stanford Encyclopedia say that currently the consensus is that there exists some important differences between imagining and believing. But there are 2 broad ways they note that we could depart from this. So one way is to think that there are intermediate cases, which make the 2 less different than we thought. Or another possible option is to think that the one reduces to the other. In this case, that imagination reduces to belief. And that's a view that has been proposed by Peter Langland-Hazan. And he has a book coming out in which he's going to put forward the case for this view. He has a post this week, that is from Wednesday, on my blog, The Junkyard, where he's also putting forth an argument for that. So if you're interested in the reductive view, you can look at that blog post or wait for his coming book or look at some of his other published work. But for our purposes, there's a big distinction between the contrast view and these other 3 views, because the contrast view says that imagination and belief are different in kind, the other views think not. But the cluster view and the continuum view think that they're the same in kind, but that they differ in degree, and the reductive view thinks that they're the same in kind and the same in degree. So going forward, I'm just going to focus on the contrast in the continuum view, but I just wanted you to see sort of the space of views that are out there. Okay, so with that said about what the continuum thesis claims, I'm going to try to look at the arguments that people have given for the continuum thesis. I should say that these are, in most cases, maybe in all cases, these are my attempted reconstructions of the arguments. So they are presented in this kind of argument form in the literature. But there are definitely at least three different phenomena that are put forward to motivate the continuum view. So the first phenomenon, and this comes from Curry and Giardini, is a phenomenon that they call overcoherence. So this is a tendency to impose coherence where there is none. Maybe this is a kind of delusion. But so the tendency in many cases seems to lie in a mistaken conception about how agency operates in the world. Either because you think that your own agency is powerless in the face of the agency of mysterious beings, right? And so you over-cohere everything that you see happening you draw all this coherence, over-cohere probably isn't it, verb, due to the agency that you attribute to mysterious beings. Or maybe, conversely, you see your own agency as like super, super powerful. So like you're causing all these things to happen. You're the source for all these things. And so you see lots of things as deriving from your own agency. So both of those tendencies are tendencies towards over-coherence. So in one case, someone else is controlling me. In another case, I'm controlling everything. Like everything depends on what I do or I say. Then we have the case of delusions. A lot of times, two different delusions are talked about specifically, Capgras and Cotard delusion. Adam mentioned the Cotard delusion, I think, earlier. The delusion in which people sincerely assert that they themselves are dead. They take themselves to be dead. And Capgras delusion, people sincerely report that their spouses or other family members have been replaced by identical imposters. So those are another source of evidence for the continuum thesis. I'll explain why in a second. And then the third source is imaginative immersion. This comes from Schellenberg. She looks at both games of make-believe and method acting. And she says that the most relevant characteristic of imaginative immersion is that the subject does not consciously think about the fact that she's imagining, rather she's immersed in fiction. And the thought is that in these cases of imaginative immersion, the subject is not always in a state that can be characterized nicely as either imagining or belief, but somewhere between the two. Okay, so I'm going to focus in what follows on delusion and imaginative immersion. This is partly for reasons of time and partly because Curry and Giardini use overcoherence to motivate the cluster view, not the continuum view, but also because probably most of what's said about delusion could apply to overcoherence as well if we take it to be a kind of delusion. Okay, so the basic idea, the basic argument is that here we have phenomena that are not neatly, we have states in these phenomena that are not neatly characterized as either belief or imagination. Okay? And then, in imaginative immersion, we have a further consideration, which is not just that the subject might sometimes be in these states that are not neatly described as either belief or imagination, but that the subject might sometimes move seamlessly from mental states that could be called pure imaginings to mental states that are, to at least some degree, belief-like, or perhaps even belief. So it's this seamless transition that's also playing a role in the argument. And I think that means that we have two kinds of arguments. So one kind of argument depends on functional role. They say that delusions don't match the functional profile of either belief or imagining, but they lie somewhere in between. And then we have this seamless move kind of argument. To say that delusions prompt states that are in some respects belief-like and in some respects imagination-like is to say that in some sense the functional profiles of these states resemble belief, and in some sense they resemble the functional profiles of imagining. So if normally belief plays functional role, say A, B, C, and imagination, these aren't the same letters for the clusters, but I mean, that is, I'm not picking out the same clusters I was talking about before. But so if normally belief plays functional roles A, B, C, and imagination normally plays functional roles D, E, F, now we might see states that are playing functional roles A, B, F, or A, E, F, and so on. So the states can't be neatly characterized either way. Okay, so that means in order to see the argument, we have to think a little bit about the functional profiles of belief, functional profiles of imagination, and why these states from these phenomena don't neatly match either one. Okay, so the functional profile that's characteristic of belief, and this is how Egan puts it. He says in this kind of state, there's a certain kind of evidence responsiveness. So your belief is both formed on the basis of evidence, and it's revised in light of new evidence. Also, with respect to belief, beliefs generate, when you're in a state of belief, that generates various inferences, the appropriate inferences that would follow from that belief. Beliefs also play a distinctive role in guided behavior and a distinctive role in generating effective responses. And then Egan says that delusions don't meet these things, or at least not as nicely as we would think. So he says that delusions are not evidence responsive, and they don't generate all of the appropriate inferences, they don't play the right role in guided behavior, they don't play the right role in generating effective responses. They're considerably more, as he puts it, circumspect than beliefs normally are. So we can talk more about this later on if you want more detail, but basically take a subject who has Cotard delusion. That belief was not formed on the basis of evidence that they have that they themselves are dead. Right? And they don't, as they continue to get new evidence that suggests that they are alive, like people are interacting with them or whatever else is happening, they don't revise their belief. So it doesn't seem to be evidence responsive. Also, they seem not to draw all the inferences that you think would be appropriate. Likewise, in the case of Capgras delusion, the subject of Capgras delusion, Egan says, does not adapt an overall worldview that would be the kind of worldview that would make sense in a world in which one's spouse or significant to others has been displaced by imposters, identical imposters. So they don't adapt their worldview to the state that they have. And he gives other examples of how they don't play the right role in guided behavior or generating effective responses. But we might just note that generally they don't seem to have as strong an effective response as we might expect from someone who really thinks this is like an imposter living in their house. So delusions, he says, don't really fit the functional profile of beliefs. Now, imagining, in contrast to belief, we get a sort of different picture. So imagining is evidence independent and not evidence responsive. And then we have a much more circumscribed inferential role because of quarantining and imagination. We have a more circumscribed behavior guiding role. We have a more circumscribed role in generating effective response. So that's not to say that imagination doesn't motivate behavior or doesn't motivate effective responses, but the role is considerably more circumscribed. So you might think that we should just put delusions in that category, but Egan doesn't think that they fit that category either. So they're sort of not as fully evidence independent as imagining, but not as evidence dependent as belief, and likewise not as circumscribed as imagining, not as uncircumscribed as belief. So he thinks they fall somewhere in the middle. Okay. Likewise, on Schellenberg's picture, we have, I think she agrees with what Egan says about the functional profiles, but she adds this further component that I mentioned quickly earlier, which is that when you have a belief, you take the content of your belief to be true, Whereas when you have imagining, you need not take the content of your imagining to be true. So she says, for example, if I'm immersed in imagining, first of all, normally when we imagine something, so if I'm imagining that I'm a pirate, right, I don't have to take it to be true that I'm a pirate, just imagining myself as a pirate. But then when we enter into imaginings and we become immersed, Schellenberg says, in cases of imaginative immersion, if I'm immersed in imagining that I'm a talented wizard, I may start to take it to be true that I'm a talented wizard. In these cases, the imagining subject has mental states that are belief-like, in that the imagining subject comes close to taking the subject matter of her imagination to be true. So the subject is playing some kind of game of pretend, let's say, imagining that she's a talented wizard, and as she gets more and more involved in her game or in her imagining, she starts to take it to be true that she's a talented wizard, and now that state no longer looks fully imagining-like, it starts to look more belief-like, or so Schellenberg says. Okay, so this is where I try to give a little reconstruction of what I think is going on. I think the argument from functional profiles goes something like this. Imagination and belief have different functional profiles. Delusion does not perfectly match the functional profile of either imagination or belief, but instead partly matches one and partly matches another. This would only be possible if imagination and belief were on a continuum, or at least this would not be possible if imagination and belief were fully contrasting states. And so imagination and belief are on a continuum. And so I take it that's how the argument roughly goes. And then, in terms of the argument from seamless transition, which I mentioned, the thought that we can move in cases of immersion from a state that's imagining to a state that's much more belief-like. So Schellenberg says that in order to account for imaginative immersion, we're required to account for this possibility of moving seamlessly from one to the other. Here's what she says in support of it. The typical starting point of a game of make-believe may be a pure imagining. As the subject immerses herself in the game of make-believe, the cognitive role of her mental state may start taking on characteristics of the cognitive role of belief. Arguably, one thing that marks a good actor is the ability to swiftly move up and down the continuum between imaginings and belief, that is, to swiftly slip in and out of character. So the kinds of cases of imaginative immersion that are often talked about are cases of pretense, so games of make-believe, and also certain cases of acting, particularly method acting. So here's how I reconstruct this argument. In imaginative immersion, we start off in a state that is a pure imagining and then seamlessly move to a state that is belief-like, or at least sometimes we do. This would only be possible if imagination and belief were on a continuum, so she concludes that imagination and belief are on a continuum. Okay, so as I say, these are my argument reconstructions, these two arguments. I think they make the best sense of what Egan and Schellenberg are trying to do in their papers, and they also give us something like an argument for the claim they're trying to argue for. Okay, so I said at the start that I thought that the case for the continuum thesis was weaker than its proponents would have us believe, and that we're not forced to adopt it. And so I want to assess these arguments. But in doing so, I want to just note that you might think, let's say all I show is that, oh, their case isn't very good. That might, you think, put us at sort of a stalemate. My mic just go out? Can you still hear me? Yes, you can hear me? No one was listening. Okay. So in some sense, we might be at a stalemate, but other people have argued that those of us who believe in the contrast thesis are in a better state here because a cognitive, so this is a quote from Doggett and Lau, a cognitive architecture that collapses distinct attitudes on the basis of borderline cases is unlikely to be fruitful in explaining psychological phenomena. So the thought is that if we were at a stalemate with respect to argument, the more explanatory power we get from a sort of contrast view, just in general in cognitive architecture, will settle the stalemate. Now, I find that kind of argument persuasive. I won't really be able to discuss it here, but I just mention it to motivate my thought that we're not, in showing that these arguments aren't good, and in showing that we're not forced to adopt the continuum view, I think we should also just, not just we're not forced to adopt it, but that we shouldn't adopt it. I think there are considerations that suggest that. Okay. Assessing the argument. So first let me note, just in fairness, that Egan, in putting forward the claim, doesn't actually commit to the truth of the claim. So he says, oh, I don't take myself to establish that this account is true, but I take myself to establish that it's not crazy. And then he also says that postulating such intermediate states is not conceptually incoherent and not compatible with any obvious facts about our actual psychologies. So this is sort of his careful position when he's stating things carefully. I guess as I read the paper, it sounds to me like he is presenting the case for its truth, not just for its lack of craziness. But in any case, the way that he talks in his careful moments, he takes himself to be clearing conceptual space for it, as opposed to establishing its truth. But Schellenberg is considerably more committal. She does commit to its truth. She's interested in explaining how imaginings, beliefs, and desires relate to produce actions and effective responses. That's part of her overall aim in the paper. And so she takes, as she works through her overall view, she takes a commitment to the continuum thesis to be a constraint on viable answers to the questions about how beliefs, imaginings, and desires work together to motivate action. So she is committed to its truth. So I'm going to start in my assessment with the argument from seamless transition, because I think it can be dismissed more easily. And so what Schellenberg is thinking, I think, is that if you have a sort of, and I guess many of you have been reading some of the literature on imagination lately, so you've probably seen some of the papers that have these like boxes all over the place, right? And we have the imagination box, and then we have the belief box, and so on. This sort of boxological picture, this cognitive architecture picture, you might see it in like Stitch and Nichols or Doggett and Egan or other kinds of places. And I think Schellenberg's thought is that if we just have like an imagination box over here and a belief box over here, then there's sort of no way to account for the seamless transition, because you're either in one box or you're in the other box. And so the only way we can account for the seamless transition is if we have imagination and belief together in the same box, right? Then we're not moving in and out of boxes or something like that. Okay, but so the first thing to note about this is that Schellenberg actually doesn't quite say that we start at an imagining and we end up at a belief, but says that we end up at something belief-like. Okay? And so it's not clear that we ever need to get all the way into that other box, so to speak. And then I think that part of what is making her argument seem plausible, insofar as it seems plausible, and in particular, part of what's lying behind premise 2, is the thought that, well, imaginative immersion is really widespread, right? Like, don't kids get really immersed in their games all the time? And when we think of it this way, it looks like, hey, we have this phenomenon that's completely common, right? Kids are playing games all the time, and they get really into it. So we must account for this phenomenon, and so we must have some continuum to explain what kids are doing when they're playing these games. But I guess, to push back on this, I don't think that the phenomenon that Schellenberg is talking about is all that common. I do think that kids get immersed in their games of pretense, but not in the way that Schellenberg is talking about. They get really into their games, but they don't get immersed in what I think she's using the notion of immersion here in something like a technical sense. So when kids get really into their games of pretense, do they really start to take it to be true that they're crocodiles or dogs or cats? I mean, they get really into it, and they're acting really, really cat-like and really, really dog-like. But do they start to think, you know, oh, it's true that I'm a crocodile, it's true that I'm a dog? That doesn't seem to me to kind of, I mean, maybe I'm just not an immersed pretender, but it doesn't seem to me that that's quite what's happening when we get really into these games. So I think in the technical sense of immersion, it's really, really uncommon. I mean, that's not to say it never happens. Maybe it happens. So the famous case that's often cited is the movie, the Andy Kaufman movie that starred Jim Carrey. I think it was called Man on the Moon. And Jim Carrey apparently stayed in role for character for like the whole 3 months or however many months it was filming. And people said that he started to take it to be true. I mean, to use Schellenberg's language, he started to take it to be true that he was actually Andy Kaufman. He would respond that way in all situations, never broke character, if reports are to be believed. And so when we compare what kids are doing in pretense games, I don't think it's like that. And so the kind of immersion that Schellenberg is talking about that's more difficult to accommodate, I think is really, really, really uncommon. And it starts to be so uncommon. I mean, it's such a weird phenomenon that I think we might have something else going on there than a sort of seamless transition from imagining to belief. I'm not quite sure what to say about it, but it doesn't quite seem like that's what we want to talk about. So if we do have some cases, like what's going on in the Jim Carrey case, where someone starts off imagining something and ends up believing it, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a continuum. It could just mean that there's a change in state, right? Like, so we start off imagining, and now we end up believing. So just compare a change from believing to not believing, right? There's not always a single moment, like a snap moment, where you've shifted from believing to not believing. But that's not to say there's like there has to be a continuum between believing and not believing. And the same thing, I think, could be the case for the change from imagining to believing. I think you can think of lots of examples like this. So you can move from a state of love to a state of hate without going through an intermediary state that's sort of love-like and sort of hate-like. And so if we can make these transitions, then we don't need to postulate a continuum in these other kinds of transitions that, in a sense, seem seamless. Then I don't see why we have to postulate a continuum here. So now, consider some, so let's try to think about what's wrong with this argument, like where exactly this argument goes wrong. And so I guess I think that either premise one is just false, or at least the way in which it's true does not require us to go to something like 2. So if we consider complex imaginings, so non-immersed imaginings, so all kinds of imaginings for decision-making or problem-solving, I think there are various parts of those imaginings that are in fact taken to be true, but they're still imaginings. We don't feel the need to characterize them as partly belief-like. Or insofar as we do, we wouldn't need to postulate a parallel premise like 2 to account for them. A parallel premise like 2 would not be plausible for those kinds of complex imaginings. So I guess I think something like that's true for the case of immersed pretense. Okay, how am I doing on time? 7 minutes, I missed the slide. Okay, so going to the argument on functional profiles. I guess I want to say, I'm going to end up saying something similar about this argument. So either 2 is false, this claim about delusion not perfectly matching the functional profile of either, or insofar as it's true, it's not true in a way that demands that we go to something like 3. So it's a kind of similar strategy that I'm taking with respect to both arguments. And I think what I want to say, I'm going to coin my own technical word here, is that there's a certain smudginess here in functional profile. And so I think that the functional roles of ordinary belief and ordinary imagining are a lot smudgier than this argument would have us believe. The argument suggests that they're super neat and super distinct, and I don't think that's true, but yet I think that it's not true in a way that still allows us to retain perfectly well the ordinary categories of belief and imagining. Or at least we weren't inclined to give up ordinary belief and ordinary imagining as contrasting states, given the smudginess. And so either we're going to be in these weird intermediate states all the time, or we're not in them in these kinds of situations. Okay, so there are many examples of states that are ordinarily classified non-problematically as beliefs, but that depart in various ways from that very neat standard functional profile mentioned above. So take, for example, superstitious beliefs. It's not clear to me that superstitious beliefs are evidence-dependent or evidence-responsive, for example. And yet, we normally treat them as beliefs and not as imaginings. Or consider, I don't know, there's probably a good word for this kind of belief, but I couldn't think of it, so I'm just going to call it a disruptive belief. And what I have in mind are beliefs that when they're acquired, they're very disruptive to your whole cognitive network, right? So you find out something that like throws a lot of other things, well, up in the air in various ways. So you can come up with lots of examples. Here's one example. So consider someone whose spouse has just died. And so she now has the belief that her spouse is dead. And I think in a lot of cases, there's no question that someone whose spouse has just died has the belief, but yet keeps acting in all sorts of ways that don't fit well with this belief. And she also manifests other beliefs that don't fit well with this belief, right? So she does all sorts of things that she would only be doing if her husband were still alive. She thinks, oh, he's going to take out the trash on Tuesday, right? But then, oh, right, he's dead. So he's not going to take out the trash on Tuesday. But she still, might just form the belief, he's taking out the trash on Tuesday. Or just think of all these kinds of beliefs that she hasn't updated, okay? I'm not inclined to say in this case that she's imagining that her spouse is still alive. I think she just hasn't updated her belief network yet. I don't think she's by-imagining, in this intermediate state of by-imagination that her spouse is still alive. I don't think that's how we would normally describe it. Perhaps we would say that the belief hasn't yet been fully integrated into her overall belief network or fully incorporated in one's cognitive network. Anyway, these are the kinds of beliefs I have in mind, superstitious beliefs and then what I'm calling disruptive beliefs, to point us towards this kind of smudginess. Now, Egan says at one point that if we think a certain kind, this is what he's trying to motivate his case, he says if we think that a certain kind of evidence responsiveness is essential to belief, then we have trouble classifying delusional states as beliefs. And I guess I'm suggesting, so he might now say, well, we shouldn't classify these as beliefs either. But I guess I'm trying to point to these kind of phenomena to suggest that we don't think this very narrow kind of evidence responsiveness is essential to belief. That is, that will tolerate some, again, technical term smudginess here. All right, likewise, I think there's going to be examples of states that are ordinarily classified non-problematically as imaginings, but that depart in various ways from the standard profile mentioned earlier. So I think there's some smudginess here too. We have all different sorts of examples, but I'll just focus for a second on what I'm calling unwelcome imagining. So sometimes people are asked in experiments to imagine that they'll be told, this bottle contains poison and this bottle does not, right? But they know full well that there's water in them. It's just, maybe they even put the water in them themselves, but now this one has the big poison X, and so they will only drink, from this bottle, won't drink from this bottle. Now, what's going on in this case? Well, maybe what's going on is that they're imagining that the bottle contains poison. It doesn't seem like they believe it. And imagining generates these behavioral responses in this case that seem to fit better with the case of belief than with the case of imagining. Or likewise, if you have a child who's imagining that there's 1 minute. Okay, not going to quite make 1 minute, but I'll try to make 2. Who's imagining that there's a monster under the bed. I don't think the child is going to behave in circumscribed ways. All right, I have 1 minute left. So what am I going to do with that? Yeah, I guess I'll do these slides and I won't do my closing thoughts. So I wanted to point out also that one way we might unravel this is by thinking about whether the belief is occurrent or not. Certain aspects of a belief's functional profile depend on its being occurrent. So we have to think about whether the delusion is occurrent or not. And also, especially in the case of delusion, there are going to be other explanations operative to explain some of the oddities about the functional profile of the delusion, because in some cases there might be other kinds of physiological changes. So, I won't be able to do my closing thoughts for you. I sort of anticipated that. They weren't that exciting. I didn't bring them out in discussion anyway. But I guess what I'm thinking is that the arguments don't really hold up. And they sort of, to my mind, make a mess of what we think about when we think about imagination. And so if the arguments don't hold up, then we should stick with the contrast view. Okay, so I'll stop there.
So now we have some comments from Bill Rinch from the Department of Philosophy here at Bill Kent.
Thanks very much. I'm going to come to the front. And something's going up on the screen, but there's also a printed version of it coming around. So I probably won't talk about everything that's on the handout, but what I say will be selected from. So first of all, just to set the scene, we've got the Continuum thesis, that belief and imagination exist on the continuum, and Amy's position is that arguments for the Continuum thesis are somewhat undercompelling. In fact, considerations about the nature of delusion don't establish that CT is true, and nor do considerations about imaginative emotion. You've heard all that. So, I think Amy is absolutely right to be suspicious of the continuity thesis, and that the arguments that she's been discussing are bad arguments. In fact, I think that might actually be overly generous to the proponents of CT, at least in Schellenberg's case. I'm not even sure what the argument is supposed to be. I think the charitable reconstruction is an argument, but I'm not sure I see it in the text. But I wonder if more convincing arguments might be available if we move away from the sort of causal role functionalism that seems to be presupposed both by Schellenberg and Egan, towards some other kind of conception of what it is that distinguishes belief and imagination. And I think there are two ways you might go for that. You might do it in a teleo-functionalist way, or you might do it by adopting some kind of normative essentialism, where you say, well, the key about belief is it's regulated by a norm of truth, and that's not true for imagination. So I want to offer advocates of the continuum thesis some better arguments, or maybe some actual arguments, or at least some argumentative strategies. But at the end of the day, I don't think they're going to work. Okay. So I think it's worth noting that, the continuum thesis, I find the statement of it very, very confusing. There's three things that the metaphor of a continuum suggests to me, but it's not clear to me that advocates of the continuum thesis believe all these things. So here's one thing, the idea that there are intermediate states, states that are neither completely belief-like nor imagination. Okay. I don't think that's enough to justify talk of a continuum, right? Okay? There's a continuum between red and yellow. That doesn't mean, there's red, yellow, and orange. There's a whole range of states between red, yellow, and orange. So, a second thing we have is the idea of continuous variation. I think the red, yellow, orange language suggests to me we've got variation across a single dimension. And again, I'm not sure whether advocates of CT are committed to that. So here are 3 quotes from Schellenberg, all from sort of very close parts in the paper. Here's one, he says, while red and yellow may be said to be on a continuum insofar as the colours between yellow and red are produced by mixing various quantities of yellow and red, the way in which beliefs and imaginings are on a continuum is more complex. Okay, that sounds like it's going to be more than one dimension. Okay, and there are reasons why you might think that. But then if you look at 2 and 3, if they're identified relative to a cluster of functional roles, which I think he thinks they are, then the relevant continuum can be understood as follows. With a loss of roles characteristic of imagination and a gain of roles characteristic of belief, a person comes to have a state that's intermediate between the two. Okay, that's what I've called on the handout IS, but it doesn't give us CV or SD. And here's a third quote. When someone's in a state of imaginative imagination, her mental state may not be easily categorized as either an imagining or a belief. Well, again, that seems like a commitment to intermediate states, but it doesn't give you either continuous variation or variation across a single dimension. Okay. So I wonder how seriously we're supposed to take the thesis that it's a continuum thesis. And I've got 3 observations about that. So here's one thought you might think. You might think the causal role of imagination and belief differ in at least 2 ways. Typical inputs to belief are different from typical inputs to imagination. Other beliefs, perception, and so on. And typical outputs for belief and imagination are going to be different. So, if there is continuous variation, you might imagine that there'd be continuous variation across at least 2 dimensions. Or if you like online-offline talk, you could think of there are 2 switches where you can switch things online or offline, or if it's like a dimmer switch, have them more or less online or offline. So that sounds like we want more than 1 dimension of variation. So again, that's what we look as though we've got in 1, but when Schellenberg glosses that, we don't get anything like that. Okay. Appeal to states like delusion, as far as I can see, at best gets you intermediate states. It doesn't get you continuous variation. The third, appeal to states like delusion establishes at best the existence of intermediate states, and the existence of intermediate states doesn't seem enough to justify talk of a continuum, still less of multiple dimensions of variation. If you think that's what CT is, if you think it's more complex than the way that you can get from red to yellow via orange. Okay, so I've got 2 concerns about the plausibility of any form of continuity thesis. So, it's natural to think that imagination is a mental process whose paradigmatic instances are subject to direction by the will. We've had lots of examples of people being told to imagine things. We haven't had very many examples of people being told to believe things. Okay. Now, I don't want to overstate this. Some imagination is involuntary. Sometimes we work hard to get rid of our beliefs, particularly if they're problematic beliefs, racist beliefs, and so on. But it still looks as though we've got a big distinction here, and it's not really clear that talk of a continuum makes sense. But I think a bigger problem is a problem about a difference between the temporal profiles of imagination and belief. Imagining is a process or activity, it's datable, it has stages, it can be interrupted, it can take a certain length of time, it can be resumed. Belief's not like that at all, right? Not even when we're talking about the current belief. Yeah. We can't talk about the stages of belief. So, this is rather old-fashioned, sort of Wittgensteiny stuff, but, you know, we've had, you see this in the recent literature and the work of people like Alan Stewart, Matthew Sitorio, and so on. I think we ought to take these things quite seriously. Okay. I was told as a first-year student, you should never accept in philosophy arguments from authority. I'm just about to offer you an argument for authority, so because I was told this as a first-year student, you should not accept the following argument from authority. Okay, there's a lot of appeal to the psychopathology literature. Sorry. Can I finish the sentence?
You started, so you're finished.
Okay. The sentence that I want to finish is, if you look at the psychopathology, if you look at the philosophy of psychopathology, the view that delusions aren't beliefs, the non-doxastic view of delusions, is very much not the mainstream view. And there's a reason that people tend to think that it's a bad view, and that is it adopts an over-idealized conception of what the causal role of belief is. So, you know, if you read people like Egan, they seem to talk as though, you know, this is the standard view to hold about delusions. But if you look at people who, you know that literature really well, that doesn't seem to be the case. Okay, well, I had hoped to offer some better arguments for the Continuum thesis. That can maybe wait for another time.